panelists here today. We did have two other panelists that were scheduled to be here. Unfortunately, they didn't get our email confirmation, something about they didn't back up their systems. It's going around. I heard there's some other groups that don't back up as well. But in all honesty, we've got a great show here today. And to kind of set the stage, I just want to let everybody know a little bit about what today's topic is going to be about. And as Hamlet might say, to meet or not to meet? That's the question. And on one hand, we have the vegans, and on the other hand, we have the paleos. And you can boil it down to this. The paleos want you to eat meat, and the vegans don't want you to eat meat. Now, if only if it were that simple. The fact is that this is much more complex than that. When you look at eating a paleo diet, it's about going back to a time where things were much simpler. Going back to a time before we had things like GMOs and McDonald's and fast foods, and eating as though the cavemen did. And when you look at eating a vegan diet, eating a vegan diet it's more than just not eating meat. I mean, eating mac and cheese and pizza makes you no more a vegan than standing in a garage makes you a car. Okay, so being able to look at the vegan lifestyle is what people will tell you is it is a lifestyle. It's more than just a diet. It's about a way of living. And so that's what's really important here is that we kind of get this information. And personally, this information has had a tremendous impact on my own life and the value of a plant-based diet, which is really why I was very excited and adamant about with Mark that we do this panel and we really bring this information and education out to everybody. So that's why I'm real excited here. Personally, in my own life, being able to be involved with things that are health conscious, as some of you might have read, I used to have my own show on the Manga Report over on Fox Business, which is kind of when I started becoming involved with things that were health-minded and wellness-minded. And actually it was at that time where I met somebody who introduced me to healthy living, and during that time made a profound impact on my life. Started eating more of a plant-based diet, and even did things like last year or early this year, I ran my first half marathon, looked to run my first full marathon later on within the coming year. And I think it's just so important being able to eat a balanced diet and being focused on wellness. So without further ado, I want to get the debate started here. On representing the paleos here, we have a best-selling author. He's the author of the Paleo Manifesto, which will be available at the bookstore today after today's panel is done. And he'll be also signing books. We have John Durant. And then representing the vegans, really a true titan and someone I was very moved by his presentation earlier on conscious capitalism. I mean, really somebody who does more than just talks the talk. He walks the walk, a man who speaks with just tremendous authenticity. And we're very honored and very lucky to have him here, John Mackey. So the format for today's debate, we're going to have about 8 to 10-minute opening presentations, followed by kind of conversation, rebuttal style. We're going to talk about all kinds of different issues, everything from GMOs, talking about are fish safe to eat, the value of carbohydrates, how does diet impact our immune system. We're really going to delve into a lot of these different issues as they come up, and then afterwards we're going to have a brief time for Q&A. So we hope to fit everything in, and without ado, let's get started with the vegans here and John Mackey.
Well, Colin Campbell canceled out today, and well, that left it all up on my shoulders here, but hopefully I'll represent a plant-based diet well. I hope so. So first I want to set the table by, pun intended, just talking a little bit about the overall macro condition that we find ourselves in today in the United States. The United States is a remarkably unhealthy nation, which I'm about to demonstrate to you. And obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and autoimmune diseases. What people don't realize is these diseases are not common in rural societies that eat traditional diets. They are really a product of modern civilization and modern dietary patterns. And it's my position that these diseases can either be completely avoided or delayed until you're really, really old. Let's take a look at the U.S. obesity rate. We're now 69% of all U.S. adults are overweight, and 36% are obese. Trend lines are still moving up, and this is estimated to cost our economy $150 billion a year. Here you can see that the patterns over the last 40 years, 15% back in '71, and it's up to 36% in 2010. Now, type 2 diabetes often accompanies obesity, and this disease is about to become pandemic in the United States, because we have 11% of American adults who are now type 2 diabetic, but an estimated 35% are pre-diabetic, and that's 46% of all adults are heading towards diabetes in the United States. That is not a happy thing. And there are many health complications, including blindness, heart damage, foot amputations, and definitely an early and unpleasant death. Heart disease, though, right now still stands #1 as the biggest killer. Every year, more than, by the way, first part of my presentations have been on the depressing side. 1.5 million Americans are going to die from heart or stroke every year, and 800,000 will die from heart disease or stroke, and it's 2,200 citizens every single day. Think about that. That's how many people we lost in 9/11. We went out and spent $1 trillion in wars that didn't do anything. But here we are losing 2,200 citizens every single day for, I would argue, a disease that no one should ever get. Of course, heart disease is terrible, but everybody's really scared of cancer. That seems to strike randomly. We all know people that we love have had cancer. We may have had cancer. And more people are going to die in the next 27 months than all the Americans have died in all the wars that we've ever fought since the founding of the Republic. What people don't realize is that there are very identifiable factors for cancer, and by far the two biggest are diet and the use of tobacco. Those account somewhere between 65 and 90% of all cancers traced back to those two, with diet being the biggest one. If you were trying to destroy America, if that was your goal, you couldn't have done a more effective job, probably, than just designing the diet that we currently eat in the United States. It was like it was programmed to kill us. Here you see 62% of the calories are hyper-processed carbohydrates and oils. Oils, sweets, refined carbohydrates. 25.5% are into animal foods, which are also, I might add, for the most part, very industrialized. Factory farm beef, factory farm chickens, farm fish, caged eggs, and that's 25.5% of our calories. Americans only eat 12.5% of their calories come from what are whole plant foods, meaning fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. So by the refined foods, which 62%, these are all recognizable foods that people eat every single day: cakes, soft drinks, cookies, donuts, white bread, white pasta, and oil. Most people don't realize that oil is also a highly processed food, with the exception of olive oil, but all the oils, none of them have nutrient density, and they're 120 calories per tablespoon. And we consume a lot of oil. These are what at Whole Foods we've identified as the 4 pillars of healthy eating. We should focus on eating natural whole foods, eat mostly plant-based. I'm actually not, it's going to be very disappointing, although I've been a vegan myself for 11 years, I'm not going to make an argument today that the vegan diet is the ideal diet. I think humans have evolved as omnivores, that were primarily plant-based omnivores. And that is the natural diet, to eat mostly plants, supplemented with some animal foods when you can get it. That's how we evolved, and I'd still argue that's an incredibly healthy diet. I am personally a vegan for ethical reasons. That might come in later, but I'm not going to talk about that unless it goes into Q&A. We should choose healthy fats, fats that come from whole natural foods, primarily plant foods. And then we should pay attention to nutrient density, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So what are not whole foods? What are not natural whole foods? Refined grains and flours. I know John's going to have some nasty things to say about that. Concentrated sugars of all types. all the artificial sweeteners, colorings, and preservatives, those are not even foods. All the food oils, concentrated fats such as butter and lard, and most processed foods that you'd find in the center of the store. And I might add, most of the foods that you oftentimes get in restaurants. Sugar in the American diet is staggering. The typical average American eats 23 teaspoons of added sugar every single day. I eat very little sugar. I think he probably eats none. So somebody out there is getting 46 teaspoons a day. You know who you are. That equates to a 3-pound bag of sugar every 12 days. One 12-ounce soft drink is equal to nearly 10 teaspoons of sugar. Look at how the soft drink consumption has gone up in our country. When I was a boy, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I am older. And when I was a kid, soft drinks were very rare. They were in these 6-ounce Coke bottles, 6 ounces. And we only got those when we were extremely well behaved, which in my case was not that often. So, but you can see that it's leveled off a bit. And of course, Americans now drink a lot more diet artificial sweetened sodas. Cheese consumption. Look what we've done in the last 100 years. We went from about 3 pounds per capita to 33.5 pounds per capita. Again, I eat no cheese. Somebody out there is eating 67 pounds of cheese. So why plant-based? What's so good about plant-based? Well, there's a lot of evidence that plant-based diets minimize whole plant food diets, minimize our risk for heart disease, cancer, diabetes. The China study, which Colin Campbell's not here to represent his thinking, is not here, but he argues that 90+% of your calories should come from plant sources. The work that Dan Butner's done with the blue zones, where he identified long-lived peoples. If you read about each one of those long-lived peoples, you will see that most of them, including the work that John Robbins did with his book Healthy in 100, that Alexander Leaf first did with the long-lived peoples around the world, they mostly eat plant-based diets. I'm going to show you a chart in just a minute. Dean Ornish's work with reversing heart disease, Esselstyn's work with reversing heart disease, Joel Furman, John McDougall, Neil Barnard, they all argue for very heavily plant-based diets. Here you see some of the similar traditional diets. I got this from John Robbins' book. The SAD diet stands for the Standard American Diet. So you can see these are all carbohydrate eaters. I mean, that's mostly eating traditional starch, whole starch foods. Because you can see that they don't have any sugar. They have 0% consumption of sugar. They have 0% obesity in the cultures. And none of them are vegans. There's never been a civilization in the history of the world that we know about that was vegan, okay? But they've all been mostly plant-based. And you can see so are these long-lived peoples. And mostly plant-based, from 90 to 99%. And a little bit, not low fat, but low to moderate fat, as they're eating somewhere between 15 and 20% of their calories from fat. By the way, fat is in virtually every food. I mean, every whole food has got fat in it, so you can't really avoid fat. I mean, I have steel-cut oats frequently for breakfast. I had them this morning. I travel with a rice cooker. I cook them up in the morning for myself. That's 13 to 14% fat, just regular steel-cut oats. So fat is not difficult to get. And very few people or anybody is suffering from a fat deficiency in their diet. This is a very important concept. This is the micronutrient density per calorie of different types of food. By micronutrients, we're talking about vitamins, we're talking about minerals, we're talking about phytonutrients. You can see that sugar and oils and refined grains, the foods that Americans eat the most of, have the least nutrient density of any possible food you could eat. Then you move up from there to cheese and dairy products, and you get into red meat, eggs, and the most nutrient-dense animal food you can eat. And it also has the wonderful thing of omega-3s, although it can also have heavy bioaccumulation of mercury and whatnot as fish. Then you get into wild meats and fowl just below that. And then, as you can see, by far the most nutrient-dense foods you can eat are really green vegetables. particularly leafy green vegetables. These are the nutrient powerhouses. And then we move down from there. So what about low-carb diets? That have been around for the last 2 decades. We've got the Atkins diet, we've got the South Beach diet, the Zone, and more recently, Paleo diet and the Primal diet. Now, these diets they can lose weight for people. There's no question about it, particularly in the short run. If you're careful about the calories consumed, once you begin to take high levels of glucose out of your system and your insulin levels are not popping up, your body will begin to burn fat off. And that's why those low-carb diets work. So it can be a healthy diet to lose weight, but I would question whether or not in the long term that's going to be the healthiest diet that can sustain you. I would argue that we have evolved primarily as plant eaters. If you look at our teeth, if you look at our digestive systems, they are very, very similar to our primate cousins. I mean, we share over 98% of the same DNA that gorillas have and close to 99% of the DNA that chimpanzees and bonobos share. And gorillas are 100% vegan, and chimps and bonobos are somewhere between 95 and 99% plant eaters. And the main animal foods they eat are insects, which John will have more to say about. But termites, in particular, chimpanzees are fond of. And they get eggs, and when they can get meat, they go for it. They just can't get it that much. But when they can get a little monkey, they will rip it apart and eat it. And so chimpanzees were thought to be vegetarians for a long time, but Jane Goodall put that rumor to bed. But still, they're mostly plant eaters. There's strong correlative evidence. Now, somebody's going to say, well, correlation is not causation, but you can't do these type of controlled experiments on human beings. You can do them on rats. You can do them on some laboratory animals, but you can't prove causation in nutrition very easily. But that doesn't mean correlation is not important statistical data. And the correlations show that people that eat high levels of animal foods over the long term, A, don't live as long, B, they get heart disease, and C, they have higher incidence of cancer. That's what the data shows. Simple carbohydrates, such as concentrated sugars, white rice, white flour, white pasta, these should be minimized or completely eliminated from your diet. This is something I completely agree with on the paleos people, and I agree with John's going to say on that. These are very bad foods. They don't have nutrient density in them. They wreck your blood sugar. All the criticisms that are made about those diets from the paleo perspective I think are 100% correct. But I think they throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I think the starch foods that are natural whole foods, such as yams, beans, winter squashes, intact whole grains, but not flour, once it's ground into flour, it begins to play havoc on your insulin levels. So I personally try to avoid bread, for example. I try not to eat very much pasta and other, certainly not donuts and that kind of stuff. I think that's really, really bad for you. Here's the main point. All known historical civilizations we've ever known all subsisted primarily on starch foods, no exceptions. You can find some people on the margin like the Inuits up there in the Arctic Circle. They can't grow anything. They've made a life out of living just on animal foods for the most part. But I'm not sure, they don't, now they're sick as can be because they got Western foods in there, and we don't really know enough about them pre-Western foods. But we do know that all the historical civilizations are primarily subsistent on heavy doses of starch foods. What about the paleo diets? There are many good things I like about the paleo diet. The people that I've known that switched to paleo diets, many of them flourish on it. And it's because they stopped eating all the garbage. They stopped eating all those processed, refined carbohydrates, the sugar, the white flour, and by God, anybody that gets off the standard American diet is going to do better, I promise you. Also, a lot of the paleo people do not eat dairy products, and I don't think dairy products are healthy food. Again, these are very manipulated animals. If you can get a cow yourself and take care of it and love it, or you have a friend that's doing that and get milk that way, or goats, that might be okay in small quantities. But I'm in the grocery business, and I tell you what they're doing to cows would shock you if I went over it with you. It's horrible, and it's all about turning the cows to raise their productivity. And I would argue that's non-healthy foods. And then I would say that the long-term risk of obesity, heart disease, and cancer from a heavy animal foods diet is something that we don't know yet. We'll see how the paleos do in 30 years. It'll be very, very interesting to see how it works out for them. A couple things, and I'm going to wrap up here. At Whole Foods Market, we have something called the Total Health Immersion. And since we launched this back in 2009, we've had 2,900 team members at Whole Foods Market go through this. These are our sickest team members. These are team members who are obese, who have type 2 diabetes, who have heart disease, or who have a very high risk of cholesterol, high-risk cholesterol and blood pressure. We've put them through it, and those who stick with the diet, and we've worked with 4 different programs, will stick with a natural whole foods, mostly plant-based diet, doesn't have to be vegan, make significant health gains. Their cholesterol plummets, type 2 diabetes is reversed. Well, I got a couple examples here. Here's one guy, store team leader of one of our Sacramento stores. In 6 months, he lost 70 pounds. His blood pressure dropped from 156/96 to 115/75. He reversed his type 2 diabetes. His blood sugar now tests between 70 and 80. We've had dozens and dozens of people lose over 100 pounds in less than a year through this program. And by the way, we're opening this program up for the public. If you see my presentation on Saturday, I think it is, I'll give you details on that. Here's another success story. He lost, in 4 months, he lost 75 pounds. Blood pressure dropped from 145/95 to 100/65. And his waist dropped from 58 to 40, and his blood pressure dropped, well, I don't have his cholesterol here, but I'm sure that plummeted as well. Okay, that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Let's see. Is there a way to?
You can close it up.
Just close it. Or close the file.
Just close the top, and then we'll turn it off. It'll turn it on.
Well, it's great to be here, and it's an honor to be on the same stage as John Mackey. I really admire what you've done with Whole Foods and in the food system. And we were talking outside, and he suggested we call this a dialogue, not a debate. And I agree with that, because there are many things that we actually do agree about in terms of healthy diets, environmental things, ethical issues. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about those some more. So what's a healthy diet? It's a really complicated question these days. There are all sorts of different health authorities that are saying different things, and it's hard to figure out what direction to go. You have doctors saying one thing, and the local newscasters, and you have all these studies coming out that are contradictory. So the question is, how can we get 80% of the way there with all this confusion going on? And it's complicated because when you start talking about diets are very personal, right? There's a reason why when you look at any religion around the world, dietary rules are very important within them, because it separates insiders from outsiders, and there's some other reasons for dietary rules, but it's very core to who people are and their identity, and that's as true of paleo people as it is for vegans and lots of other folks. So it's hard to talk about human diets. If you were to go to a zoo, which is one of the things I do in my book, and you were to ask the zookeepers how to keep the animals happy and healthy, what any good zookeeper would tell you is mimic their diet in the wild, or at least start there. I mean, you don't have to end there. It doesn't mean that it can't be improved upon, but it's a good starting point, because you've got lions who are obligate carnivores, and you have panda bears that are herbivores, and you have omnivores and specialists and generalists and all sorts of different types of species. So when you look at the human record and our life in the wild during the Paleolithic, it's about a 2.6 million year period. We were omnivores as well. There is concrete evidence, you don't dispute this, there's concrete evidence about 2.6 million years ago where we were using stone tools to butcher bones. They have the cut marks on bones. So humans have been eating meat for a very long time. We're adapted to eating it. Our digestive system is the digestive system of omnivores. It's sort of in between an herbivore and a carnivore, as you might expect. And when you look at our closest primate cousins, chimpanzees and bonobos, they do eat some meat. It is a small percentage in terms of calories, but it's very socially important. Male chimpanzees will trade meat for sex. It plays an important role in mating, so it's valuable and desired. So it plays an important role. When you start to look at contemporary or historical hunter-gatherer societies, it varies. The macronutrient composition of their diet varies depending on geography and season and things like that. But many of them get half of their calories or more from animal foods. There was a review of about 12, and I believe 7 of them, half of their calories came from animal foods. I did take issue with the slide that you had showing the nutrient density of different foods. If animal foods are extremely nutrient dense.
But not per calorie.
So I pulled up some stats comparing kale and beef liver, and 100 grams of each. And beef liver is higher in phosphorus, potassium, iron, zinc, vitamin A, vitamin D, niacin, vitamin B6, vitamin B12, folate. It's extremely nutrient dense. You divide it by carbohydrate has 4 calories per gram, and fat and protein have 7. So
Fat has 9.
9. So even by a factor of 2, there is 20 times more phosphorus. Kale doesn't have any vitamin A. So was that the Andy ranking? Was that chart?
It's based on vitamins, minerals, and the phytonutrients, which are very heavy in most vegetables and fruits. Things like the type of nutrients you get in a tomato that have anti-cancer properties, for example. So, yeah.
Okay. So we have some disagreement on some nutrient density, and we don't have to get into the weeds on that. Like John said, I don't have an issue with anybody eating a diet that they either find meaningful or they find healthy. People are different. They can end up with different diets based on their genome and their gut bacteria and their allergies and injuries and preferences and things like that. But that said, there are still sort of broad guidelines for what may constitute a healthy human diet. We know that when the agricultural revolution took place and humans domesticated plants and animals, our diets became very grain-based, and there's a very clear record in our skeletons that humans lost about 6 inches of height. Our bone density decreased. A lot of this had to do with infectious disease, not diet. We were living in cities, so it's not all diet related. But health definitely declined. Cavities got much worse, and we shifted from a diverse omnivorous diet of wild salmon and blueberries and roots and tubers and fruit and nuts and seeds and every part of the animal to whole rye bread and beer all day, every day. And our health suffered for it. And you look at these skeletons, and you can tell that these people were just absolutely miserable. Whereas hunter-gatherers were taller, they had thicker bone structure, and they weren't in perfect health, but they were well adapted to the lives that they led, like other wild animals in the wild. When we look at these historical civilizations that had these carbohydrate-heavy diets, it's partly because they were poor. They were poor farmers who were growing grains. They were growing wheat and corn and barley and rye, and basically were serfs and subsistence farmers, while sort of wealthy, higher class people would be the ones that could afford or had hunting grounds and ate more meat-based diets. Um, just have a couple notes here. You know, I agree that anybody who shifts away from a heavily industrial diet, whether that's sort of a healthy version of veganism, and by healthy I mean eating vegetables and whole foods, not processed, technically vegan. You know, people who stop drinking 7 Coca-Colas a day and eat some version of a whole food, they're going to get healthier. A point that I would make, though, there's a lot of debate over grains and legumes and nuts and seeds and things like that. And I want to step back and give you a little bit of an evolutionary perspective on seeds. That's sort of the category, the reproductive organ of the plant. So grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Plants have evolutionary interests, just like any other living organism. They want to propagate themselves, or the ones that have acted that way are the ones that actually do propagate themselves. So they don't want animals and insects to come along and gobble up the next generation. And that's the seed. And so plants fight, they can't run away. They don't have horns or hooves or hide. So they fight back using chemical warfare. Plants are nature's chemists. There's huge chemical diversity in the plant kingdom. Plants are the source of our medicines. They're the source of our poisons. They can be really good, or they can be really bad. It depends which one and how you prepare it. And I think we've forgotten that. I think there's this instinct now where we treat all plants, oh, it's a plant, it must be healthy, oh, it's an animal, it's not. If you're in the wild, you do not want to go up to a random plant and start nibbling on it. That is a good way to get a rash at best and get very ill or die at worst. And seeds are a concentration of both nutrients for the next generation and of some of these protective toxins. It's both. And a shell, again, is nature's way of saying stay out. It's a protective measure. So you look at wild almonds and they have cyanide in them. Now, domesticated almonds, that gene has been flipped and they don't produce cyanide and they're nutritious. So I don't have an issue there. Traditionally, lots of nuts and seeds and grains have been treated in ways to make them more nutritious. Fermentation, soaking, sprouting. Again, I think those are things that we would probably agree on, or at least those preparation practices. You know, a lot of beans and these other wild seeds are poisonous unless they've been treated. So I would just, to wrap it up, I think we can use the Paleolithic perspective as a starting point to think about parameters for what humans are most likely well adapted to. And then at that point, people can use personal experimentation to take it the rest of the way.
It sounds like they agreed on a lot. You know, they had to cut out processed foods, cut out starches, and
No, we're not cutting starches out.
Oh, okay, all right. He says he wants to cut the starch. He doesn't. Well, as a member of the media, it's my job to stir the pot. So this is what we're going to do right now. We're going to stir the pot a little bit. We're going to get these guys engaged and really kind of dig deep in some of the issues that you guys want to know about. So one of the things I want to ask to John is that a lot of people say, well, people who are vegans, you know, it's not just that they eat a plant-based diet, but these guys are exercising, they're keeping their stress low, they have all the right habits. And we've been eating meat for thousands of years. So it's not so much that eating plant foods is really making them better, but it's all the other things that they're doing. That's for you, John. Oh, you're both John. Mackie.
Well, I know healthy vegans and I know unhealthy vegans. I know a lot of junk food vegans. I know healthy paleos and I know unhealthy paleos. So diet is one component for health. I would think it's probably the most important, but also exercise, rest, sleep, attitude is very important, love is very important. So there are a lot of factors that go into making up health. I have not found vegans are more conscious in general, but so many vegans are activists. And activists, remarkably, whatever movement they're in, including the freedom movement, activists can work themselves way too hard, not rest enough, feel guilty anytime they're not working. And a lot of vegans fall into that category. So I'm not sure I agree with the statement that vegans are necessarily healthier. it's not being vegan that makes people healthier. It's getting the crap out of your diet and eating mostly plants and eating, and something John and I do agree about, you've got to in some ways experiment, and you've got to find what foods work best for you and what foods don't work best for you. And it is true that not only from an evolutionary perspective, he's correct. I mean, plants are evolving for their own purposes, and you need to eat a diversity of plants, and so you're going to have some allergies to some. Some people are allergic to gluten, for example. Some are allergic to soy. Some are allergic to eggs. Some are allergic to dairy. A lot of people are allergic to dairy. So you've got to find out. I urge people to pay attention, be conscious of how you react to foods when you eat them, as well as do regular blood tests and find out what your cholesterol is. Find out if you're responsible for your own health.
Well, John, on the topic of food allergies, because we've actually seen millions and millions of Americans find that they had food allergies that we never thought that existed before. Things, gluten now. If you go to P.F. Chang's, there's a gluten-free menu. Things like rice, soy, peanuts, everything that we're seeing. Do you think that these new food allergies, are they coming from things like GMOs that are now in our foods, or are they coming from basically the destruction of our immune systems via our poor diets?
I think it's coming from overeating the foods.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in America, we eat way too much wheat, corn, soy, from industrialized processed foods. People aren't even aware they're eating it. Corn is ubiquitous almost. If you eat whole corn, it's fine, but we're getting sugar and high fructose corn syrup. We're getting exposed to these foods in low-grade ways all the time. And I think over time, repeated exposure, it's like the first time you're exposed to poison ivy, you may not have a reaction to it, but if you get multiple repeat experiences, you're going to develop an allergy for it. And I think it's the same way with food. If you eat any kind of food too frequently, your body may develop an allergy to it because you're getting too many of the toxins. There are toxins in almost every food. You're getting too much of it, and you can develop an allergy.
And we've also destroyed our gut bacteria through overuse of antibiotics and alcohol consumption and decline of live culture fermented foods and wheat, corn, and soy intake. And food allergies aren't the only autoimmune conditions that have been rising. All types of autoimmune conditions have been going up, and a lot of those originate in the gut. So if you damage and destroy your gut, then the immune system can become hyperactive and respond to threats that might not actually be threats.
Well, one of the things we're going to do right now, we're going to go into the Q&A session. So I think since Mark's the founder of Freedom Fest, he gets to ask the first question.
I don't answer questions about GMOs in public forums, so don't ask me any questions about GMOs. I don't talk about sex.
John Durant does talk about that if you read his book.
I finished just reading a book called Grain Brain. Have you seen that book?
Yeah, I read it.
And it's kind of a paleo diet type of thing. I mean, every suggested diet included meat and stuff. But the thing that really surprised me more than anything was his argument that study after study says that high cholesterol is not bad. So is high cholesterol good or bad? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, high cholesterol does correlate. I'm not saying it's the cause, but it correlates with both heart disease and with cancer. So is it causing that? Or, I don't know, but it shows up.
And low cholesterol is associated with suicide, mental illness, cancer, mortality.
Uh-oh, I have very low cholesterol.
So our understanding of cholesterol or over the last 50 years has been very halting. And it used to be that all cholesterol was a unitary molecule and it was all bad. And then we realized there was good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And then there were different types of HDL or LDL. And so I think most of the cholesterol you eat in your diet gets excreted in your feces.
Well,
it comes right out.
Yeah. One of the best evidences about cholesterol is the long-term Framingham study that has been going on for 60 years now. And there are only 3 known cases of anybody that's ever died from a heart attack in the Framingham study, and we're talking about well over 100,000 people at this point, who maintain cholesterol below overall cholesterol below 150. So generally, if you can maintain your not through drugs, but through diet, if you maintain cholesterol below 150, chances are you may commit suicide, but you will not die of a heart attack.
I'm very pro cholesterol. I
Well,
think
time will tell.
there's studies that have come
You're
out.
a young man. Let's see how it works out for you.
I think we're gonna arm wrestle by the end of this thing.
Well, I'm twice your age. That's not fair.
You can use 2 arms.
How about my leg?
Okay, John, I know you've been high on the China study. Have you seen anything that would refute the methodology or anything that went into that study, and you still a big believer in it? And secondly, I didn't quite understand why you say you don't eat meat for ethical reasons. Are you saying if you want to live to be 100, it's okay to eat a little bit of meat and a little bit of fish, or would you just eliminate them both? Like,
I mean, the longest lived peoples were not vegans. They were plant-based, and they ate mostly natural whole food plants, but did eat some animal foods like wild-caught salmon or grass-fed beef or some natural raw dairy and goat milk and things like that. So small quantities of animal foods are consistent, and they also, unless you're in a very intelligent vegan that really knows your stuff, you can develop certain nutritional deficits over time on a strict vegan diet, which is evidence that vegan is not a natural human condition. For example, B12 is one that is not found in any plants. And
You're making all my points for me.
But I'm arguing for that 90 to 99% plant-based diet, and I think that's the healthiest diet. So, but I think a vegan diet can be extremely healthy. I'm a pure vegan, and I think my diet's extremely healthy. I do supplement, and I check my blood regularly, and I don't get sick. At the end of the day, it's how does it work for you? Are you healthy? Do you live long? How's your weight? How's your blood pressure? How do you feel? How's your vitality? How's your resistance? How strong is your immune system? That's a test, and that's this working extremely well for me personally. And I've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that have gone through our immersions at Whole Foods, reversed chronic diseases. And when I tour our stores, team members just come up to me all the time and thank me for having gone through the immersion. It changed their lives, and they're so grateful they got their lives back. And I think I've known people on a paleo diet who are also healthy. So different strokes for different folks. But I would argue that over the long term, the paleo diet has not yet been tested, and we will see how it fares over the long term.
I'll pick a little fight over the China study. What doesn't come through in the book, The China Study, that does come through in the published literature from the data collected during that study, is that the single highest correlation between overall mortality and any of the dietary elements was wheat intake. Intake of wheat was the single highest correlation with overall mortality, which is really what most people are worried about. Fish was the most beneficial of the foods that had a strongly positive effect. So I do have some methodological issues with the China study. And I think that in the book, some of them have been glossed over.
Unfortunately, Professor Campbell is not here to defend this study.
Whew!
But you know what? Read the China study and make up your own mind.
Sure. I have read it, and I'm mostly vegan. And my question, you mentioned, John, regarding gut health, and that's a big problem. And you also mentioned in your slide, the amount of soft drinks and soda. So my thinking is, wouldn't it make sense to have like a probiotic soda?
Kombucha, it exists.
Yeah.
That's tea, but other than kombucha tea, just soda made with fermenting probiotic water, mixing it with different flavors,
But it is it's a probiotic beverage, and that's his point.
Yeah, that's my point. And
there's all kinds of probiotic beverages out there actually now. Many of them have too much sugar in them, so you got to pay attention to that.
all right. So you would recommend if you can find a good one that doesn't have any sugars in it, it would be
Or little sugar. It's all
Okay.
matter degree.
great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
VSL is a good probiotic, by the way. VSL. Yeah.
I am a vegan or a chegan because I cheat every once in a while and have a little fish and
A
chicken.
Chegan, I love that.
But It's a real tragedy, I think, for most people in this room not to have met Dr. Campbell. I had lunch with him last year at Freedom Fest, and I've seen him in 2 other presentations. And the facts that are most important to me as a PhD and someone who really analyzes things that comes out of the China study are that we have 17 times as much heart disease as the Chinese did in the 70s when that data was collected. And in the 70s, they were really vegan because they couldn't afford meat and dairy. They had 1/5 of the breast cancer that we have. And another figure that's so important is the difference between vegan and vegetarian. 87% of the protein that's in milk, not the fat, but the protein, is something called casein. And in his animal studies, when he gave casein, fed casein to his animals, I think it was
Rabbits.
rats,
Rats or rabbits?
the results were absolutely unambiguous. 100% death by cancer with a 20% diet of casein.
Right.
And
the response that's often made by that, not to take the paleo position, but just on that particular issue, is that yes, that shows that casein, dairy products, are cancer promoters. But then a lot of paleo people say you shouldn't eat dairy. That's another industrialized product. And if you read Lauren Cordain, who's really kind of credited as the founder of that movement, he recommends no dairy products.
well, that's
And
one
they would
thing
say
I would
that's
eat.
what the China study shows, that dairy promotes cancer, but doesn't necessarily say that grass-fed beef does.
At the same time, in terms of perspective, humans are mammals, and a strict, say, vegan position wouldn't include breastfeeding because breast milk comes from an animal.
No.
Well, let's be consistent here. Let's be consistent here.
No
The,
other species, after it gets past, it's weaned, continues to drink milk from another species. We're the only ones that do that.
Correct. So I don't dispute that. But at the same time, dairy. When we look at some herding cultures like the Mongols or the Maasai in Africa, they also have low rates of cardiovascular disease, and they do tend to be robust. I mean, I eat a little bit of dairy in my own life, and I think there are drawbacks to it. But when you look at the Mongols, I mean, there are all sorts of historical reports that they were better fed and stronger than all the people they were conquering, and dairy was a huge part of their diet.
One of the challenges now in the dairy is that we don't, and this is a challenge for just like John was talking about, foods have been altered so much, and today the type of dairy products that we get and the type of meat you get is all coming from factory farms. I think it's hard to prove it, but one of the arguments that a lot of the paleos make that I think is at least an interesting argument is that, well, of course, we're not eating the type of animal foods that we ate when we were paleo, where you caught a lean animal that was a wild animal in the wilderness, and you ate the whole thing. You're getting all the different organ meats and whatnot. That had a completely different nutritional profile than a corn-fed fat beef, prime beef that's got loaded with fat and marbled in the meat. That's a completely different type of animal food. Or dairy cows that have been altered genetically in order to maximize their milk production. They produce 5 times as much milk as they did like 80, 100 years ago. It's astounding what we've done to those animals. And so arguably, that's not what the Mongols were doing. They were.
Just as an aside, just one thing, in case you didn't know this about John Durant, he does keep a refrigerator filled with meat, actually with animal organs next to his bedside, just in case.
It's no longer next to my bed. We found a spot for it in the kitchen. She insisted.
It's weird, and he knows that, guys. He knows it.
Sounds like Hannibal Lecter a little bit.
Well, cannibalism was a fairly regular practice among Paleolithic peoples.
But
so
you're not advocating that, just to be clear.
If I were to advocate it, You should eat somebody who eats paleo.
Bioaccumulation of toxins, bad idea.
Next question.
Yes, Paleo John indirectly referred to my question a minute ago. Dr. William Davis, a cardiologist from Milwaukee, wrote a book called Wheat Belly. Would be interested in most of your comments from either one of you. Thanks.
Well, there's been a lot of attention paid to wheat and gluten.
What is gluten, by the way?
Gluten
you hear
is-
everything
is-
about gluten. What
Gluten
is
is
it?
the main protein in wheat. It's actually a combination of sort of two different proteins. It's the main protein in wheat. Modern wheat has been bred to have a much higher gluten content than it used to. Farmers will basically get compensated on the protein content of their wheat. We've destroyed our gut bacteria. We don't use traditional baking practices anymore. And so it's quite possible that it may have been easier to eat wheat using traditional practices, traditional recipes, preparation methods than how people eat it today.
The plant we call wheat today, according to him, bears no resemblance to amber waves of grain 2-3 generations ago.
Nothing you eat today bears resemblance to
Yeah.
what things were. I mean, we've evolved our food. We've been evolving it. I mean, the fruits that you get, they have a much greater impact on our blood sugar than probably the fruits that we got pre-industrial, because they've been selectively bred to be sweeter. So more sugar, less fiber. And we've been, and that's not necessarily bad, we've made our food source far more edible and palatable, but there have been some trade-offs. And in the case of fruit, we're getting a much higher dose of sugar than we used to one time get. And that's something why you have to pay attention. You can't eat too many fruits, or you're messing again with your insulin levels. I have read Wheat Belly, and for those of you that want to YouTube this, it's pretty interesting. They made a video called vegan versus low carb, or low carb versus vegan, and it's something Dr. John McDougall, one of the doctors Whole Foods worked with, who's also a good friend of mine, and it was very interesting because they show a lot of the advocates for low carbs, not necessarily paleo, but they show pictures of them. I mean, William Davis is fat to obese.
If you'd like to come to the CrossFit Games in Los Angeles in a month or two, it is a very vital looking group.
I'm
of
merely
people.
saying the spokespeople that are older for these diets. Lauren Cordain, I've seen pictures of him recently. I mean, he shows on his books a picture of him when he was like 30 years old, but you look at him today and he's borderline obese.
Weren't the
You've got
lifespans?
the Atkins diet. Dr. Atkins definitely, was an obese man. He probably died from stroke or heart attack, but they didn't do the autopsy. So, hey, you're 31 years old, dude. You look, you look great.
There are a lot of
I'm not
vegans.
gonna arm
There are a
wrestle
lot
you.
of stick figure vegans who.
I'm not, as again, I have
I
not
think we
argued
should back
strictly
away
for
from
vegan.
the-
I've argued for plant-strong,
All right.
with a natural whole foods, plant-strong diet or plant-based diet. If you want to eat a little bit of animal foods, it's probably not going to harm you. Once you start getting your calorie base, in my opinion, much over 10% of your calories, the correlative evidence begins to show that your risk for heart disease and cancer begins to go up.
Well, as far as for John Durant, wasn't the lifespan of a caveman much shorter than it is right now?
Well, the lifespan of early farmers who ate almost an entire plant-based diet was very short, even shorter. So I don't think that's early hunter-gatherers had all sorts of threats, violence, other animals, weather, poisonous things. So hunter-gatherers today with very minimal modern medicines regularly live into their 60s and 70s. Their lifespan actually declined when we shifted from a hunter-gatherer, in my reading of the literature, animal-based diet to a plant-based diet.
Well, one of the things we probably disagree on is that, to me, it was gatherer-hunters. They mostly lived on plant foods, and they ate animal foods when they can get them. They couldn't store them very well. They had to feast when they could get them, and they weren't able to be, frozen or put in the deep freeze. So you ate them when you had them, and you didn't always have them, and so you mostly subsisted, I think, mostly on plants. There's a lot of evidence that we don't really know what the true Paleolithic caveman diet is. So there's lots of different scientific disagreements about that.
Evolutionary biologists are, it's a pretty well supported theory that once we started to have more regular meat in our diet, it helped allow the brain to expand. The brain consumes 20 to 25% of our calories. It's very expensive. It's like a data center that requires a lot of electricity, and you can't support that on just wild plants.
My cats mostly just eat meat, and they're stupid as can be.
Well, you probably shouldn't feed them fancy feasts. So that,
Yeah.
We'll go to the next question.
You refer to Dr. Furman and Dr. McDougall. Both of them, when they fail with the patients, when they get an extreme case, they send to a doctor called Dr. Alan Goldhammer, who has gone one step further. In Santa Rosa, he has a SOS-free, which means salt, oil, and sugar-free, plant-based vegan diet with no flour as well, and does water-only fasting as well, which I have done 30 days, and I was cured of an incurable sickness.
Yeah.
When you talk of the paleo diet, there is a dispute, and we are more confused than ever about between paleo and vegan, what should be or what should not be. But paleo does not address that meat these days comes with growth hormones, with steroids, with pesticides.
That's why you should shop at Whole Foods Market.
Yes. Yes. Have you got rid of all of these?
Yes.
You have.
Paleo
And
folks
what
pay a
about
lot
the-
of
what
attention.
about the mercury in the fish? Have you got rid of the mercury in the fish? Only the small fish, you're likely want to eat only the small fish because they're not that much contaminated
Well,
with mercury.
you need to go into one of our stores and look at our sustainable fish program, which is ranked #1 by Greenpeace for the last 2 years.
One, in relation to that question, one issue that I'll bring up is the effectiveness. I want to question the effectiveness of vegetarianism to actually change the factory farm system, because it's vegetarianism and veganism is essentially, from an economic standpoint, a boycott on meat. But boycotts only work if you can get a significant portion of people to engage in them to change the behavior of the major players. But if 5% of the population or 2% of the population doesn't eat meat, the big agribusinesses lose some money, but it's a one-time hit, and then they turn around and sell industrially grown soybeans as Boca burgers right back to vegans and vegetarians. Whereas if you get a bunch of folks that are willing to pay top dollar for properly raised animals, properly caught fish, that creates a profit motive to get entrepreneurs to actually create a better system.
Next question.
That's my business model.
I was wondering if you guys would agree to do a blood panel comparison, and we could all judge for ourselves.
Well,
I think they were going to do arm
He doesn't
wrestling.
think if I show good cholesterol, he's going to say that's bad. I'm going to commit suicide.
I mean, I'm happy to share all my numbers, but that's not a good scientific way to arrive at an answer. I mean, I'm an open book, but we should try to move beyond anecdote to science.
And even things like cholesterol, when you look at things you find in a normal CBC, don't always tell the true picture of a person's health. I mean, we see a lot of stage 4 cancer patients over at the Stem Cell Institute, and they have actually perfect CBCs. They're actually normal down the line. And so you really can't get a true measure of somebody's health by looking at that. You really need to look at the person's immune system. He talked about the microbacteria within the gut, and then looking at what's going on within the lymphocytes as a real measure of health. Next question. Yes.
Great.
Talk about numbers. I'm a vegan. I'm mostly raw vegan, and I did that for health reasons. I've lost 42 pounds over the last year and kept it off by being a raw food vegan. I'm a graduate of the Hippocrates Health Institute Health Educator Program. I have a couple comments in response to lack of B12 in the plants. That's true. But according to the China study in Chapter 10, you can hold on to B12 for up to 3 years. You store it. I get my B12 from blue-green algae and spirulina. Great sources of B12.
They're not that great of sources.
well, blue-green algae has like 1,200% per serving of B12. But I can't believe that you say that you're pro-cholesterol when 500,000 people will have their chests opened up and have heart bypass surgery every year. We don't have a dietary requirement for cholesterol. The liver makes cholesterol, and it's clogging our arteries, and it's creating acidosis conditions. And we didn't even talk about acidosis.
Well,
Meat is acid-causing, and it leaches calcium from the bones. So I'll let you respond. I just want to say no to paleo.
Oh.
Thank you so much. I really do respect both of you on the panel here. But
After disrespecting you, I really do respect you.
you know what though? Here's the deal.
No. All right, you've asked your question. That's enough.
That's
okay.
Next
All right. I agree with the magnitude of the issue here. There's an enormous amount of chronic health conditions that have exploded in the developed world. And for the last 50 years, this country has been just on this huge anti-fat crusade. And fat is become this devil, this boogeyman. And the most two recent big meta-studies that have come out on saturated fat, for example, over the last 4 years or so, which have gotten a lot of press, have basically concluded that saturated fat intake does not have any relationship to cardiovascular disease. And if it is a deep, deep problem if our public health authorities are ignoring the science that's out there and are pushing an anti-fat orthodoxy that is actually killing people. So you say, how can I say that about cholesterol? It's because I think the current fear of cholesterol is killing people. Yeah, seriously.
Okay, you've talked a lot about vegetables and vegetarian diets or veganism, but you haven't addressed, at least I haven't heard a whole lot, about how you eat the stuff. I mean, it makes no difference if you eat only vegetables and you overcook them and there's nothing left in them, or you buy vegetables that don't have very many nutrients left because they took a week or two to get to you.
It's a great comment. I mean, how we cook fermented food. I eat a mix of raw and cooked foods. Foods that are organic or local often are more nutrient dense from good soil. So it's absolutely important.
I mean, yeah, it's obvious you ought to eat as fresh food as possible.
Well, one of the knocks that people have is that to eat a vegan diet, it's that the vegetables taste bland, or they don't like the way it's cooked, or they don't like how they taste, and that your mother would always say, eat your vegetables. You never really liked it. How do you make eating vegetables something that's tasty and people like?
This is
Put butter on them.
This is a very important.
That's bad. Paleos don't like butter.
This is very important. You will learn to like whatever food you eat. That's a simple truth. You can run and discover that yourself with your own experiments. Every culture likes their own food they grow up on. The trick here, in our palates and our taste buds turn over very quickly. And I've taught myself. I grew up on the standard American diet. I just grew up eating crap, and I never ate any vegetables. And I re-educated my palate by, if you expose yourself to food somewhere between 10 to 15 times, you'll learn to like it. You'll go from, I don't like that, to, yeah, I don't really like it, but I can eat it, to, that's not so bad, to, that's good. I know that, have another helping of that. And we should teach our palates to eat the healthiest foods we can. Because there's no loss in pleasure. The thing that holds people back and prevents them from eating a healthy diet is their fear that they're going to lose pleasure. And the secret to that is to know that if you continue to persevere and you continue to educate your palate, you will learn to like the foods that you eat. And it's easy to test, to do the empirical test for that. And of course it helps if you develop skill in cooking. I happen to like vegetables, but I oftentimes, he puts butter on it. I might put a bean sauce on it. I might create some kind of nut sauce and mix it with the vegetables in a little bit. There's lots of interesting ways to make vegetables, which I think taste pretty good, taste even better. But it does require, one of the things that's being lost in America is any type of average person's skill in cooking. And if you want to be healthy, you're not going to get it at restaurants. And you should, one of you in the family unit should become a skilled cook. It'll repay itself in pleasure and health many, many times over.
Our last two questions.
Thanks for both being here, and I totally agree with that. After going a Whole Foods plant-based for 2.5 years, I would honestly, I think a green smoothie tastes better than cheesecake now because my palate's changed. But my question had to do with the China study, and so I guess it's really going to you, John. One thing that they demonstrated, also speaking on the misconception of fats being bad and cholesterol and all that, is the misconception that you have to have a super amount of protein, where the China study showed that it switches on your insulin-like growth factor hormones that makes your body go into growth mode where you'll grow really big, but your cells don't repair themselves, so that's why cancer becomes so prevalent. Could you speak on that?
The China study doesn't show anything about insulin-like growth factor because that's Campbell's bringing other science or interpretation to bear. For those who aren't aware, the China study was what's called a large observational or correlational study conducted mostly in the 70s in China. What they did was they aggregated there are different sort of provinces in China, and they aggregated data at the province level for about 60-some different provinces. And then they had aggregate statistics for the typical diet that was eaten within that province, and because China was very poor at the time, it was fairly similar. But you still lose a lot of data there. There's an average diet for an entire province, like an entire state in the US. And then they had aggregate health outcomes for that same province. That's having 65 data points is not much. I mean, there's lots of underlying cases, but those were all rolled up and aggregated into about 65 data points. And it's portrayed as if it's this like amazing huge study, and it's not. I mean, it's 65 aggregated data points that are then correlated with a much larger number of health outcomes. And in terms of statistical power, it's actually not that high. But when you look at the correlations, the strongest correlation is wheat intake with overall mortality.
But if I could just add, like the China study, Campbell's book isn't just the China study, it's also a whole wealth of literature that he's collected from other studies and his own studies since the actual China study itself in China.
You know, one of the best data points in all this discussion, which hasn't really been talked about, are the work that a lot of these doctors have done, the clinical data that people like McDougall and Esselstyn and Furman have done for years. And as I said in my presentation, when Whole Foods, we've taken 2,900 team members and sick team members and put them through this process. And you know, I don't know if it's the perfect diet. These doctors have different. Some are vegan, some are not vegan. There could be a very skilled paleo doctor who might have good results, but all I know is that this diet works for anybody that stays on it. I've yet to see anybody at Whole Foods stay on that diet and have bad results. So I'm sticking with the Whole Foods natural plant-based diet, and I'm vegan for ethical reasons, but I don't think eating small quantities of animal foods is inconsistent with good health. I agree that we evolved as omnivores, and human beings are primarily plant-based omnivores. And if you eat natural whole foods, plant-based omnivores, don't eat a bunch of processed carbohydrates, sugar, white flour, and crap. And if you want to eat some animal foods, I think you're going to be a very healthy person. That's what I think.
Last question.